any professional in this field has seen during their working lives, end quote. Mark Lowcock from the United Nations. Nicholas Kristof continues, and I quote Kristof, "What is most infuriating is that the hunger is caused not by drought or extreme weather, but by cynical and failed policies in Riyadh and Washington. The starvation does not seem to be an accidental byproduct of war, but rather a weapon in it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, backed by the United States, are trying to inflict pain to gain leverage over and destabilize the Houthi rebels. The reason the Houthis are allied with Iran." Kristof continues, and I quote, "The problem in Yemen is not so much a shortage of food as it is an economic collapse. GDP has fallen in half since the war started. That has left people unable to afford food." End quote. Kristof continues, quote, and I want you to hear this, "We think of war casualties as men with their legs blown off. But in Yemen, the most common war casualties are children like Faraz who suffer malnutrition," end quote. Continues, "Some will die. Even the survivors may suffer lifelong brain damage. A majority of Yemen children are now believed to be physically stunted from malnutrition." Let me repeat that. A majority of Yemen children are now believed to be physically stunted from malnutrition. 46% were stunted even before the war. And physical stunting is frequently accompanied by diminished brain development. Quote, "These children are the future of Yemen," end quote. Dr. Ada Hussain, a nutrition specialist, told me looking at Fawaz, quote, "He will be stunted. How will he do in school," end quote. The war and lack of health care facilities have also led to outbreaks of deadly diseases like diphtheria and cholera. Half of the country's clinics and hospitals are closed. End of quote from Nick Kristof of the New York Times. The fact of the matter is that the United States, with very little media attention, has been Saudi Arabia's partner in this horrific war. We have been providing the bombs the Saudi-led coalition is using, refueling their planes before they drop those bombs, and assisting with intelligence. In too many cases, our weapons are being used to kill civilians. In August, there was an American-made bomb that obliterated a school bus full of young boys, killing dozens and wounding many others. A CNN report found evidence that American weapons have been used in a string of such deadly attacks on civilians since the war began. According to the independent monitoring group Yemen Data Project, between 2015 and March 2018, more than 30% of the Saudi-led coalition's targets have been non-military. A few weeks ago, in my office, I met with several brave human rights activists from Yemen. They had come to urge Congress to put a stop to this war. And they told me clearly, when Yemenis see "Made in USA" on the bombs that are killing them, it tells them that the USA is responsible for this war. And that is the sad truth. Mr. President, the bottom line is the United States should not be supporting a catastrophic war led by a despotic regime with a dangerous and irresponsible military policy. Some have suggested that Congress moving to withdraw support from this war would undermine UN efforts to reach a peace agreement. But I would argue that the exact opposite is the truth. It is the promise of unconditional U.S. support for the Saudis that has undermined the efforts toward peace. And we have evidence for this. Just yesterday, we received news that the UN Special Envoy, Richard Griffiths, made a breakthrough agreement for the exchange in that war of some 15,000 prisoners, a significant development. This is an important step in building the necessary trust for a broader peace agreement. A piece published today in TRT World observes, quote, "There seems to be a firmer willingness to reach an agreement than in previous talks as the Yemeni government realizes that the international pressure on its backer, Saudi Arabia, is growing," end quote. So our effort to move this resolution forward may have already made a positive impact, and I thank all of my 18 co-sponsors and all of the many civil society organizations, progressive and conservative, who have worked so hard to raise awareness of this horrific conflict. Mr. President, above and beyond the humanitarian crisis, this war has been a disaster for our national security and for the security of the region. The administration defends our engagement in Yemen by overstating Iranian support for the Houthi rebels. Let me be clear. Iran's support for Houthis is of serious concern for me and I believe for all of us. But the fact is that the relationship between Iran and the Houthis has only been strengthened with the intensification of the war. This war is creating the very problem the Trump administration claims to want to solve. Further, the war is also undermining the broader effort against violent extremists. A 2016 State Department report found that the conflict has helped al-Qaeda and ISIS deepen their inroads across much of the country. So this war, as I see it, is both a humanitarian and a strategic disaster. Further, and I think it's important to state what everybody knows, although we don't talk about it terribly often, that Saudi Arabia is a despotic regime controlled by one family, the Saud family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families on earth. In a 2017 report by the Cato Institute, a conservative think tank, Saudi Arabia was ranked 149th out of 159 countries for freedom and human rights. For decades, the Saudis have funded schools, mosques, and preachers who promote an extreme form of Islam known as Wahhabism. Mr. President, in Saudi Arabia today, women are not treated as second-class citizens, they are treated as third-class citizens. Women still need, in the year 2018, the permission of a male guardian to go to school or to get a job. They have to follow a strict dress code and can be stoned to death for adultery or flogged for spending time in the company of a man who is not their relative. Earlier this year, Saudi activist Lujain al-Hathlal, a leader in the fight for women's rights in Saudi Arabia, was kidnapped from Abu Dhabi and forced to return to the country. She is currently being held without charges. The same is true of many other Saudi political activists. Human Rights Watch recently reported that imprisoned women activists have been subjected to torture, including electric shocks and other forms of physical and sexual assault. Further, as every member of the Senate knows or should know, there is now overwhelming evidence that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was responsible for the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident who lived in the United States, who was a columnist for the Washington Post and made the mistake of going into the Saudi consulate in Turkey, never came out alive, and we believe that his body was dismembered and nobody knows where it is. Unbelievably, President Trump continues, despite the overwhelming evidence of the Crown Prince's involvement in the murder of a man living in the United States, a Saudi dissident journalist, President Trump continues to proclaim his love and affection for the Crown Prince and the Saudi regime. But that is not how, in my view, the American people feel. Mr. President, for too many years, American men and women in our military have put their lives on the line in the never-ending struggle for democracy and human rights. And we cannot and must not turn their struggles, their sacrifices aside in order to follow the military adventurism of a despotic regime. That is not what this country is supposed to be about. Finally, and an issue that has been of long concern to many of us, conservatives and progressives, is that this war has not been authorized by Congress and is therefore unconstitutional. Article 1 of the Constitution clearly states that it is Congress, not the President, that has the power to send our men and women into war. Congress, not the President. The framers of our Constitution, the founders of this country, gave the power to declare war to Congress, the branch most accountable to the people, not to the President, who is often isolated from the reality of what is taking place in our communities. But the truth is, and Democratic and Republican presidents are responsible, and Democratic and Republican Congresses are responsible, and that is that for many years, Congress has not exercised its constitutional responsibility over whether or not our young men and women go off to war. And I think there is growing sentiment all over this country from Republicans, from Democrats, from independents, from progressives, from conservatives, that the time is now that Congress cannot continue to abdicate its constitutional responsibility. Mr. President, I believe we have become far too comfortable with the United States engaging in military interventions all over the world. We have now been in Afghanistan for over 17 years, the longest war in American history. Our troops are now in Syria under what I believe are questionable authorities. The time is long overdue for Congress to reassert its constitutional role in determining when and where our country goes to war. If you want to vote for a war, vote for a war. If you want to vote against the war, vote against the war. But we as a Congress have got to accept our constitutional responsibility. That is ours, not the President's of the United States. And this resolution, Mr. President, provides that opportunity. It finally says that in this one war in Yemen, this terrible, horrific war, that Congress is prepared to act, and I hope very much that all of us will seize this opportunity. Mr. President, for the sake of starving children in Yemen, for the sake of what this country stands for in terms of democracy and human rights, and not following the leadership of a despotic, authoritarian regime, for the sake of the United States Constitution, and the fact that it is Congress and not the President that has the authority to make war. For all of these reasons and more, Mr. President, I ask strong support for this important resolution. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I want to thank the Senator for most of the comments that he made. I think they were made very eloquently, and I share many of the same concerns that the Senator has. I voted to cause this to come out of committee because I felt like this discussion on the Senate floor needed to take place. The Senator from Vermont knows I've got concerns about using this vehicle to do it, but by causing this debate to take place, many of the concerns that the Senator have expressed will be expressed by others, and I agree with many of those. Saudi Arabia has not conducted this war in a manner, in my opinion, that takes into account the great harm that is taking place with civilians. I agree with that 100%. I am more than nonplussed over the fact that I believe, and I've sat in a very detailed intelligence review of what happened with the journalist at the consulate in Turkey, and I absolutely believe that if the Crown Prince came before a jury here in the United States of America, he would be convicted guilty in under 30 minutes. I absolutely believe he directed it, I believe he monitored it, and I believe he is responsible for it. So I have had concerns about using this vehicle, and I have concerns about the fact that what this may mean as we set a precedent about refueling and intelligence activities being considered hostilities. I'm concerned about that. And I think the Senator knows that we have operations throughout northern Africa where we're working with other governments on intelligence to counter terrorism. And we're doing refueling activities in northern Africa now. And it concerns me, he knows I have concerns, that if we use this vehicle, then we may have 30 or 40 instances where this vehicle might be used to do something that really should not be dealt with by the War Powers Act. Now, I will say, the strong passage of the germaneness issue that we just dispensed with helps. It helps a great deal so that now in the future, if this particular vehicle is utilized, we now know that we've set the precedent that only germane issues can be brought up. And I did have concerns, and we've now solved those, that other issues might be brought up, and all of a sudden the leaders would lose control of the floor. I would like to see members have more votes. I agree with that. But I think we've now narrowed this in a very appropriate way. The Senator and I have discussed a resolution that is separate and apart from this. Separate and apart from this. And I've agreed with senators on the other side of the aisle that I will not introduce that resolution until this issue has been dispensed with. I do hope we'll have a unanimous vote on it to strongly condemn the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia for the actions that he has taken relative to killing the journalist who is a resident of the United States, has children living here in the consulate in Turkey. And that's a separate issue that I hope we will take up almost immediately after we dispense with this. But I want to thank the Senator for his concern. I share many of those. We have some legal concerns right now about using this vehicle, and he knows that. And I'm concerned about where this goes down the road, and we'll have some amendments that we'll deal with over the next day or so that may clear that up to a degree. But I just want to say to him, even though we have legal concerns about this particular process, I thank him for his concern for the citizens there, for his admonishment, for his demarching of a crown prince in Saudi Arabia who I believe is out of control, doing things on top of killing journalists, but also in blockading Qatar without even thinking, arresting a prime minister in Lebanon. Things that no one would think would be appropriate for international norms. So with that, I yield the floor. I know we'll have other speakers coming down. We may disagree on process, but many of the issues that he's brought up today, I agree wholeheartedly with.